Her husband returned from a business trip with a pregnant mistress and handed his wife over to pay off debts. But upon seeing her a year later at a governor's reception, Carlos had always been the most popular guy in school. He played football, had a sharp tongue, and was never a coward. Almost every girl in Carmen's class had a crush on him. During breaks, all they did was talk about his numerous virtues. Carmen was utterly tired of hearing it. She didn't think about boys at all. She was more interested in books and research. Her father was a true scientist and inventor. The attic of their house was a real laboratory where he conducted experiments, studying various things and phenomena. Senor Miguel was passionate about his work and inadvertently instilled a love for science, engineering, and technology in his daughter. From a young age, she showed an extraordinary curiosity about the world and sought to understand its laws. Carmen grew up in a creative environment where no experiments were forbidden. Her father allowed her to spend as much time in his lab as she wanted. Carmen would spend entire days there. She loved watching her father work and learning the basics of physics and mechanics. Under Miguel's guidance, she often dismantled old clocks and mechanisms to understand how they worked, and then easily reassembled them. Carmen dreamed of one day following in her father's footsteps and becoming an inventor and scientist herself. She planned to apply to a university's engineering department, so she studied everything that could help her get admitted. Her classmates never saw her without a book. Carmen diligently studied in all her free time. That's why conversations about the handsome Carlos didn't interest her at all. However, Carlos suddenly became interested in Carmen. He couldn't understand why this plain, bookish girl wasn't chasing after him like all the others. The guy couldn't fathom why she hadn't fallen for his charm, which made other girls swoon. Determined, Carlos decided to win Carmen over and make her fall in love with him. One day, during a break, he approached her in front of everyone and casually invited her to see a new movie. "What's it about?" Carmen asked, not looking up from her book. "I think it's a comedy," Carlos replied through gritted teeth. "I don't like made-up stories," she said indifferently, flipping a page. "I prefer documentaries." Carlos clenched his jaw tightly and walked away from the girl. His friends looked at him in surprise and pity. The girls whispered, "Seriously?" She turned down a movie with Carlos. They couldn't believe it. Carmen started being avoided by her classmates, but this didn't bother her. All her thoughts were occupied by science and research. However, Carlos didn't give up and continued to follow Carmen around. He plucked flowers from the school garden and left them on her desk, and once, he even brought a kitten to school to impress her. Still, Carmen paid no attention to him. So, Carlos decided to use trickery. He persuaded his friends to ambush the girl in one of the alleys she walked through on her way home. When the boys surrounded Carmen, she was initially scared. But when she saw Carlos appear from around the corner, she understood everything. "You came to save me?" she quipped. Of course, Carlos smiled broadly. "You're just a defenseless girl. And you're an idiot." Carmen shot back, lifting her chin as she calmly walked around the bewildered boys and strode away with her head held high. Carlos clenched his fists. "Sooner or later, you'll fall in love with me," he muttered. "I never give up." The boy continued coming up with what he thought were brilliant plans, but each one failed miserably. Carmen remained a tough nut to crack. As the prom approached, Carlos decided that he would go with her, no matter what. However, Carmen had no intention of attending the prom. "Why would I waste my time on some silly dance?" she said when she heard Carlos wanted to invite her. "But it's every girl's dream," he smirked. "I don't believe you haven't secretly imagined yourself as the prom queen." Carmen looked at him like he was crazy. "Don't I have better things to do?" she answered nonchalantly. "On Friday, my dad and I are running experiments. It's way more interesting. If we succeed, I'll be able to document the process and include it in my portfolio. That will help me get a scholarship." Carlos stared at her, completely baffled. "You're totally obsessed," he muttered. "That's why I like you so much." With that, he stepped closer, trying to kiss her on the lips, but Carmen jerked away. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed in outrage. "I can't help it," Carlos admitted. "I really like you, Carmen." "That's your problem," she snapped and quickly walked away. Carmen passed her exams with flying colors and was accepted into the university of her dreams with a scholarship. Moving to the capital, she thought she would leave her classmates and everything that happened in school behind forever. But things didn't go exactly as she expected. Carlos also moved to the capital. He had been accepted into a prestigious sports college where he became captain of the football team. Carlos and Carmen unexpectedly ran into each other at a student concert. Despite always considering him somewhat shallow, Carmen was pleased to see someone familiar. She hadn't yet made close friends with her classmates, many of whom were just as introverted and focused on their studies as she was. Carlos, once again, tried to flirt with her, but she quickly shut him down. "Listen, Garcia," she said rather bluntly. "Let's just stay friends, or better yet, don't even come near me." Carlos nodded in understanding. "All right, Carmen," he agreed. "Whatever you say. Friends it is." They exchanged phone numbers, and Carlos began inviting Carmen to hang out often. She agreed, mainly because she felt lonely in the capital without her beloved father and caring mother. Carlos reminded her of home. With him, she could be herself. They really did become good friends. The two spent a lot of time together, going to see documentaries that Carmen enjoyed, though Carlos would often fall asleep halfway through, visiting museums, and strolling through parks. Carmen grew used to Carlos, but she still couldn't say she was in love with him. Her studies were always her top priority. Besides, she was constantly participating in academic competitions and working on her own scientific projects, which consumed most of her time. One day, when Carlos invited her to meet up, Carmen waited for a long time at their agreed-upon spot, but he never showed. Upset and a little angry, she went home. She sent Carlos an angry text, but he didn't respond. Carmen even considered deleting his number but changed her mind at the last moment. "I'll just ignore the fact that he stood me up, and I won't talk to him anymore," she decided. "If he's so unreliable and doesn't value our friendship, let him find someone else." Carmen was always very firm in her decisions. However, it turned out that the situation wasn't as simple as she thought. A few days later, she found out that Carlos had fallen ill. Racked with guilt for thinking poorly of him, Carmen rushed to the hospital. The doctor allowed her to visit, but only for a short time. "What happened?" Carmen asked. "I don't know if I'm going to make it," Carlos said weakly, looking pale. "It seems serious. I hope the doctors can help, but there's very little hope." Carmen couldn't hold back her tears as she looked at her friend's exhausted face. She remembered how he always went out of his way to win her over, but now she saw that Carlos was telling the truth. Carmen felt her heart soften. She began visiting him frequently, caring for him with great tenderness and attention. Every day, she brought fresh fruit and juices that Carlos liked. She supported him emotionally, sharing stories from her life and encouraging him not to lose hope in his recovery. Carmen made every effort to create a comfortable atmosphere for her friend. She brought a patchwork blanket she had sewn herself and decorated the hospital room with small but cozy trinkets. "Carmen, you're doing so much for me," Carlos said emotionally, gazing at her with gratitude. But Carmen herself felt it wasn't enough. She couldn't save his life, and only now did she realize how much Carlos had come to mean to her. One night, she had a dream that Carlos was healthy again, and they were walking down a beautiful street together. Then, he knelt down and proposed to her. At that moment, Carmen woke up with her heart racing, and only then did she fully realize that she loved Carlos. Bursting into tears, she eventually fell back asleep and woke at dawn. She quickly got ready, deciding to go to the hospital as soon as it opened. They allowed her into Carlos' room, and he was already awake when she arrived. "What are you doing here so early, Carmen?" Carlos asked, surprised. "I came because I was scared," she admitted, sitting on the edge of his bed. "Of what?" Carlos asked, taking her hand. That I might never see you again, Carmen whispered. Silly girl. Carlos replied gently, looking at her fondly. The doctor told me yesterday that I'm getting better. Carmen could hardly believe what she heard. Really? I'm so happy. She smiled through her tears. Carlos softly patted her shoulder. And we'll be able to walk around the city and go to the movies again, just like before, he said. But Carmen knew things wouldn't be like before. She felt that she loved Carlos now. Still, she couldn't bring herself to confess it. Carlos sensed the change on his own. I think you've changed, Carmen, he said. She nodded, her hands trembling. You've taken care of me all this time, Carlos continued. Carmen nodded again. Maybe now you like me more than just a friend? He asked. Maybe, Carmen echoed, her cheeks flushing. Carlos leaned up slightly so they were eye to eye. Is that true? He asked, gently touching her hair. Carmen smiled shyly, and Carlos tenderly kissed her. She didn't pull away. She wanted that soft touch of his lips to last forever. When Carlos was discharged from the hospital, he and Carmen were inseparable, and a few months later, her dream came true. Her beloved proposed to her. Of course, I agree, my dear Carlos. Carmen responded. But we're still so young, and both of us are studying. How can we live in our own apartment when we don't even have the money to rent one? For the first time, Carlos seemed to really think about it. I'll ask my father for money, he replied simply. Carmen shook her head. But that's not serious. We need to stand on our own feet, she said. Carlos hugged her and whispered in her ear. Don't worry, my love, I'll handle it. They said their usual tender goodbyes in front of Carmen's dormitory, and later that night, as she lay in bed, Carlos texted her to wish her a good night. But the next day, he didn't call or message her at all. Carmen began to worry. She couldn't understand where Carlos had disappeared to since this had never happened before. She called him, but he didn't answer. By evening, her anxiety only grew. She called Carlos's best friend, Diego, and other acquaintances, but no one knew where he was. Carmen went to bed but couldn't sleep for a long time. She had a gnawing feeling that something terrible had happened to Carlos. Her intuition told her he needed help, but she didn't know what she could do. The next morning, nothing had changed. Carlos still hadn't answered any of her calls. Finally, late in the evening, just as she was about to contact the police, Carlos called her. He sounded tired, but happy. Where have you been? Carmen asked. I was so worried about you. I'm fine, my love. I was just handling the issue we talked about last time. Were you looking for a job? Carmen asked, surprised. You could say that, Carlos replied evasively. Don't ask me anything more. Just remember, there's nothing for you to worry about. We'll always have money from now on. Carmen felt uneasy when she heard this, but no matter how much she tried to ask Carlos more questions, he remained tight-lipped or simply told her she didn't need to know. Eventually, she gave up and didn't bring it up again. 3 months later, they got married and moved into a beautiful house in the city center. Carmen didn't understand how Carlos had managed to buy it, but she assumed his wealthy father had helped him. She focused on her studies and her new role as a wife. Her days were spent conducting experiments, preparing for seminars and exams, and managing the household. Carlos usually came home late, and they would have dinner together before going to bed. Early the next morning, he would leave again. At first, Carmen thought he was going to college, but then she found out that Carlos had dropped out. What do you do all day? She asked. I'm making money so we can live like royalty, he replied, shrugging. But what kind of job are you doing? Carmen kept asking. I've told you, it's my business. Carlos stubbornly responded, keeping his secrets to himself. Carmen continued to focus on her career. She successfully passed her final exams and defended her thesis. She was offered a position at the department to continue her scientific work, and she eagerly accepted. Carmen began spending more and more time at work because she was bored at home. Carlos was never around, and each day he came home later and later. Sometimes he would even disappear for days without explaining why. This upset Carmen deeply. She started noticing that her husband was becoming increasingly irritable. Little things began to set him off. He was constantly on edge and could explode at any harmless comment. Sometimes he'd get calls in the middle of the night, and then he'd rush off somewhere immediately. All of this continued to worry Carmen, but she didn't know what to do about it. 6 months passed. Carmen felt like Carlos was growing more distant from her. They hardly saw each other. He was never home. When Carlos did come back, Carmen tried to avoid him. One night, he came home drunk. Carmen was already in bed, and Carlos collapsed beside her, still fully dressed, and tried to kiss her, but she was disgusted. "You reek of alcohol," she exclaimed in anger. "Where have you been?" "I was working, darling," Carlos slurred, his voice thick. "Were you waiting for me?" "Of course," Carmen answered. "I always wait for you, but you never show up. I guess you've got more important things to do." Carlos looked her in the eyes. "You're the most important thing in the world to me," he said. "Come here." He tried to embrace her again, but Carmen pulled away. "Don't touch me in this state," she shouted. "It's disgusting." Carlos staggered to his feet. "Oh, is that so? Then I'm leaving. I'll find a place where they'll accept me as I am," he declared proudly and stumbled out of the bedroom. A minute later, Carmen heard the front door slam, and she burst into tears. She didn't know where Carlos had gone, but at this point, she didn't care anymore. Carlos didn't come home for a week. Then he returned in the middle of the night, while Carmen was asleep, packed a suitcase, and left again. In the morning, when she saw his belongings were gone, Carmen broke down crying. She realized their marriage had finally come to an end. Carlos didn't appear for more than a month. One day, Carmen accidentally ran into his friend Diego on the street, and he told her that her husband had left for a business trip abroad. "You didn't know?" Diego asked in surprise. "We had a bit of a fight," Carmen admitted. "And he left without telling me anything." "That's sad," Diego replied. "I hope you two make up soon." Carmen nodded and, after saying goodbye, continued on her way. She knew deep down that there was no saving her relationship with Carlos. She realized she had made a huge mistake marrying him. However, she had no idea of the challenges that still lay ahead. Carmen threw herself into her work. It was the only way to stop thinking about her husband, to stop worrying, and to avoid sleepless nights. She was working on cutting-edge research at the department, and her progress was inspiring both to her and her colleagues. They all saw a bright future ahead for her. A few more months passed. Carmen was preparing for an international conference where she was scheduled to present her innovative project. However, it wasn't meant to happen. The evening before the conference, the front door opened, and Carlos appeared on the threshold. Carmen flinched when she saw that he wasn't alone. With him was a young, very attractive woman with long blonde hair. She stepped inside with Carlos and said in a spoiled tone, "Where should I sit, darling?" The woman was wearing a tight orange dress, and Carmen noticed how her belly stood out prominently. The sight of this made her heart shatter into pieces. Without looking at his wife, Carlos led his young lover into the next room and then returned to the living room, where Carmen sat with her arms crossed, her face stern. "Pack your things," Carlos said coldly. "What?" Carmen asked, not understanding. "You're leaving," her husband said harshly. Carmen shook her head. "I'm not going anywhere until you explain to me what's going on. I don't love you anymore. What's so hard to understand?" Carlos answered. "You rejected me that night. I don't forgive betrayal. You were drunk." Carmen cried out in despair, realizing that he wasn't joking. "My wife should love me no matter what," Carlos responded. Carmen felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "And that's why you found a mistress?" she shouted, her voice trembling with anger. "Lola has never betrayed me. And soon, we're having a son," Carlos replied coldly. "I'm happy for you," Carmen spat back bitterly. "But you're married to me, not her." Carlos looked at her, and there was a cold, steel glint in his eyes. Carmen felt a surge of fear. "This is not a big problem." Carlos hissed through his teeth. "I'm not going anywhere." Carmen replied with dignity. "This is my home." Carlos smirked. "It was your home. Once. But now everything is changing. I don't know where you'll be tomorrow, but I don't care anymore." With that, Carlos stepped closer and grabbed Carmen, lifting her into his arms as she struggled. "Let me go," she screamed, trying to break free, but Carlos was much stronger. He dragged her to the door and out onto the porch. Carmen thought he would let her go, but he didn't. Instead, he hauled her to the car, forcibly shoving her into the back seat. Then he pulled something from his pocket, and Carmen felt cold metal cuffs snap around her wrists. She couldn't believe what was happening. Was this really not a nightmare? Meanwhile, Carlos got into the driver's seat and started the engine. "Where are you taking me?" Carmen shouted, her voice rising in panic. "Have you lost your mind?" "To where you'll live from now on," Carlos replied gruffly. Carmen felt terror swelling inside her. She never thought her husband could treat her like this. "But I can't leave," she pleaded. "I have an important conference tomorrow. Let me go." "Forget about it," Carlos threw back over his shoulder. "That's all in the past. Your life is about to change entirely." He smirked again, a cruel glint in his eyes. Carmen was utterly horrified. She tried to stop him, but with her hands bound in cuffs, she was powerless. Realizing she had no choice, she slumped back in the seat, her mind racing with fear. Carlos drove for what felt like hours, and soon Carmen realized they had left the city behind. She looked out the window, her heart pounding in terror. Was he planning to get rid of her? Could her husband really be capable of something so terrible? Finally, Carlos pulled over and turned off the engine. In the dim light of a street lamp, Carmen saw what looked like an abandoned building. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. Her entire body was shaking with dread and outrage. But Carlos said nothing. He silently got out of the car, walked around to her side, and opened the door. Carmen pressed herself into the farthest corner, staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. She still couldn't believe this was really happening to her. "Get out," Carlos demanded harshly. "No," Carmen refused. "Get out now, or I won't be responsible for what happens next," he shouted. Carmen didn't move. "You'd better come out on your own, or I'll use force." Even in the darkness, Carmen could see the fury burning in his eyes. She no longer knew what her husband was capable of. Recent events left no doubt that there was much more to him than she had ever imagined. "It's better to agree," Carmen decided. She awkwardly climbed out of the car and stumbled after Carlos, who silently turned his back to her and headed toward the building. Inside, they were met by armed men wearing masks. "I brought her," Carlos said. "The boss promised to forgive my debts in exchange for my wife." "Of course," replied one of the thugs. "For such a beauty, I'd forgive you anything." Carmen froze in horror. Carlos had traded her for debts to some criminals? She barely managed to keep from fainting. Suddenly, she realized she was still wearing her silk-home robe, and a shiver ran down her spine. The men were looking at her like predators eyeing their prey. "You're not leaving me here," Carmen screamed in a voice that didn't sound like her own. But Carlos had already turned to leave. Carmen wanted to run after him, but one of the guards blocked her path. "You're staying with us," he sneered, his gaze greedy. Carmen paled. "What are you going to do with me?" she whispered, barely able to speak. "Whatever the boss says," the other guard replied. Follow me. He led her down a long, dimly lit corridor and pushed open one of the doors, ushering her into a sparsely furnished room. There was only a narrow bed, a table, and a chair. The guard stepped closer, and Carmen shrank back in fear. However, he didn't touch her, he simply removed the handcuffs from her wrists. "You'll stay here for now," the guard said gruffly before leaving the room and locking the door behind him. Carmen was left alone. "Now I'm a prisoner," she thought bitterly. She bit her lip to keep from crying. Never in her life had she imagined she could end up in such a predicament. On the bed, she spotted a blanket and quickly wrapped herself in it to keep warm. "I need to find a way to escape before it's too late," she thought. She glanced at the small window above her eye level. Perhaps she could squeeze through it, but it was barred with iron grates. "It feels like I'm in prison," Carmen thought glumly. Suddenly, she heard heavy footsteps in the corridor. Carmen shrank back in fright. The footsteps stopped right outside her door, and she heard a click as the lock turned. Carmen nearly screamed in terror. She expected the boss to walk in and pounce on her. However, that didn't happen. Someone placed a bowl of steaming food and a cup on the floor, then the door closed again. Carmen waited a moment and then approached cautiously. They had brought her food. It was plain pasta and water. She felt she needed to eat to keep her strength up. She picked up the food from the floor, set the bowl and cup on the table, and sat down in the chair, unaware of how quickly she devoured everything. After eating, she felt a little calmer and even sleepy. Carmen remembered it was already very late. "No, I can't sleep," she thought. "They can't catch me off guard." But her eyes grew heavy. Carmen barely made it to the bed before she fell into a restless sleep. She was awakened by the sound of a lock clicking and the creaking of the door. The girl instantly sat up in bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin. It was already light outside. "So I slept through the whole night," Carmen thought briefly. A man in a mask entered the room. The girl stared at him in fear, expecting the worst. However, the man didn't rush toward her. Carmen noticed he had bright blue eyes, which seemed strangely familiar. "But that can't be," she thought to herself. The man slowly approached Carmen. She pressed her back against the wall, watching him in horror, too scared to move. The stranger sat on the edge of her bed and unexpectedly removed his mask. Carmen nearly gasped in astonishment. It was Diego, Carlos's friend. "Carmen," he whispered. "I don't know what to say. I never thought Carlos was capable of this." Hearing his familiar voice, Carmen couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She had given up hope that anyone here would understand her. "This is terrible," Diego continued. "When I came here in the morning and heard that Carlos had brought his wife to settle debts, I rushed over immediately." "They didn't hurt you?" Carmen shook her head. "They said they would wait for the boss's orders," she whispered. Diego paused for a moment. "Were you very scared?" he asked, and Carmen could hear genuine concern in his voice. She just nodded in response, unable to stop the flow of bitter tears. Suddenly, Diego sat very close and hugged the girl reassuringly. She felt the strength of his arms, and she wanted to forget everything and fall asleep again. Carmen felt very small in Diego's embrace, which promised her safety and hope. "Will you help me?" Carmen whispered. "Will you help me escape from here?" Diego was silent. "The boss will never forgive me for this," he replied, and Carmen shuddered as if waking from a dream. She wanted to push Diego away and run far from here, before they caught her again and brought her back to this cold, empty cell. But Diego didn't let her go, holding her tightly in his arms. "Easy now, Carmen," he whispered to her, as if she were a little girl. "You didn't let me finish." "Yes, he will never forgive me. But I won't forgive myself if I don't help you. I won't let them touch you." With those words, Diego stood up and began to pace thoughtfully around the room. "Wait here," he said. "The boss won't be back until evening. I'll find a car that they won't be able to track and come back for you." Carmen looked at the man skeptically. Diego approached closer, crouched in front of her, and looked her straight in the eyes. "I swear to you," he whispered. "Do you trust me?" Carmen nodded, and her eyes filled with tears once again. "Wait for me," Diego said before closing the door behind him. Carmen lay back on the bed. The ghost of hope that Diego had instilled in her flickered inside like a candle flame. She didn't know how much time had passed. When they brought her food again, her heart nearly broke. This time Carmen couldn't eat a single bite, she was too anxious. What if Diego doesn't succeed, she thought despairingly. Evening would come, the boss would arrive, and she would become a toy in the hands of ruthless criminals. Carmen tried not to think about it. She remembered that somewhere in her normal world, a conference was happening right now, and she, Carmen, was not there. The thought filled her with bitterness, but she clung to it like a lifeline. She began to imagine that she was stepping onto the stage and standing behind the lectern. She cleared her throat, took a sip of water, and began her presentation. The audience listened attentively, nodding, and at the end of her speech, they even applauded. Carmen smiled and thanked everyone present. What a wonderful day, a beautiful life. Her life. The click of the lock pulled her back from her fantasy world. She suddenly returned to the cold room and straightened up. The door opened very slowly. The girl felt a chill of fear wash over her. Finally, the door opened, but no one was there. Carmen stood up and slowly walked toward the exit. Suddenly, a hand appeared in the doorway. It gestured for her to come, urging her to move faster. Carmen stepped into the hallway and almost collided with Diego. "Hurry," he whispered almost silently. Grabbing Carmen's hand, he rushed toward the exit at the end of the corridor. The girl barely managed to keep up with him. She had dropped the blanket, and now she held the edges of her silk robe closed with one hand. They reached the exit and then ran to an inconspicuous black car with dirty license plates. "Faster," Diego whispered again, opening the front door for Carmen. She hurriedly climbed inside. Diego quickly circled the car, sat behind the wheel, and started the engine. "We just need to slip away quietly," he said as he pulled out of the parking lot. Carmen heard some movement and turned around sharply, but the abandoned building behind them seemed completely uninhabited. In a moment, Diego turned the corner, causing the terrifying house to disappear from sight. "I hope I never see this place again," Carmen thought to herself. "I have nowhere to go," the girl quietly admitted when they had driven a decent distance and were approaching the city. Diego glanced at Carmen and then refocused on the road. "Don't worry, I'll take you to a safe place," he simply said. Carmen felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. "What about you?" she asked. Diego shrugged. "I'll go back." Carmen flinched, recalling the cold room where she had been held captive. "But they'll find out it was you who helped me escape," she exclaimed in alarm. "Maybe I can convince them otherwise," Diego replied. Carmen shifted uneasily in her seat. "But it's too dangerous." "I know," Diego said seriously. "But not going back there is even more dangerous." Carmen didn't know how to respond to that. Diego entered the city but didn't head toward the center, he turned onto a bypass road. After driving along it, he emerged on the other side and, nearing the edge of town, stopped in front of one of the ordinary-looking houses. The house was not very large, but it was surrounded by a tall fence. Diego helped Carmen out of the car, glancing briefly at her silk robe. "I'll give you my clothes," he said. Approaching the gate, Diego entered a code and let Carmen in before following her inside. They walked along a neat path, and the guy unlocked the front door. "There's food in the fridge and cupboards. It'll last for a couple of days, and then I'll come back and bring you some clothes," Diego said. Carmen thought she heard him want to add the word hopefully, and she felt uneasy again. Diego showed Carmen the bedroom, where a large bed with clean linen stood, then he found a few t-shirts and sweatpants so she could dress normally. Carmen sincerely thanked Diego for his kindness, and he hurriedly left. Once she was alone, Carmen sat on the white plush sofa in the living room and didn't move for a long time, watching the green leaves of the trees sway outside. It felt as if she was rediscovering this world with its warm sunlight and clear blue sky. I almost said goodbye to all this beauty, the girl thought. She was still recovering from the shock she had experienced, so she sat on the couch for a long time without moving, trying to collect herself and gather her thoughts. Then Carmen felt hungry and headed to the kitchen. In the fridge, she found drinking yogurt and granola. After snacking, she realized she was overwhelmed with exhaustion. Carmen went to the bedroom and lay down on the bed. As soon as her head touched the pillow, she immediately fell asleep. When the girl woke up, it was dark outside. At first, she didn't understand where she was. Carmen thought that everything that had happened, the Carlos and his pregnant mistress, the abandoned building teeming with criminals, the lonely room with bars on the window, had just been a dream. However, when she got out of bed and saw the outlines of the unfamiliar bedroom, she remembered that it had not been a dream. Carmen wandered around the house for a bit and then lay down again, feeling lonely and forgotten by everyone. In the morning, as the first rays of sunlight crept into the bedroom, Carmen felt a little better. She took a hot shower, put on a fresh t-shirt of Diego's that came down to her knees, and headed to the kitchen to make breakfast. While eating, Carmen pondered her new life. "I hope Diego is okay," she murmured aloud, pouring herself some more orange juice she had found in the fridge. After taking a sip, she thought about what she should do in this unfamiliar house. After breakfast, Carmen washed the dishes and set out to explore. It turned out there was no television in the house, but she discovered a small library in one of the bedrooms. There were 2 large cabinets that occupied an entire wall, their shelves overflowing with various books. Carmen spent a long time curiously examining the spines. Most of the books were fiction, but she managed to find a few good ones on physics, mathematics, and even mechanics. She took them off the shelves and carried them to the living room. Then she brewed coffee in the kitchen and comfortably settled down on the sofa with the first book in hand. Thus, the first day for Carmen in her new home passed. She read books until evening, then took a shower and went to bed. The next day, she continued reading while eagerly awaiting Diego's return. Carmen was very anxious, fearing that something bad might have happened to him. However, closer to noon, she heard the sound of an engine outside the living room window. Cautiously, she approached and hid behind the curtain. To her great relief, she saw the gate open, and Diego appeared on the path leading to the house. He looked tired, as if he hadn't slept in a long time, but overall, his appearance didn't alarm Carmen. When Diego entered, the girl greeted him with a smile. "How are you doing?" he asked cheerfully, though Carmen could sense that such a tone was difficult for him to maintain. "I'm doing fine," she quickly replied. "And you?" "More or less," Diego answered honestly. "But I'm alive, for now." Carmen paled. "Just kidding," he said tiredly. "You need to sleep," she told him. "That's exactly what I'm going to do now," Diego agreed. He headed upstairs and disappeared behind one of the doors. Carmen closed her book. "I need to make something to eat," she thought. "When Diego wakes up, he'll be hungry." She prepared risotto and baked fish. Diego appreciated Carmen's care. "I'll need to leave again in the evening," he said. "You're probably getting bored here alone?" "A little," Carmen admitted. "What can I do for you?" Diego asked. Carmen thought for a moment. She recalled her work at the university. "Do you have a computer?" Carmen asked. Diego went to his bedroom and brought back a laptop for her. "You can use it, but please, don't go on social media to keep your whereabouts the secret." Carmen thanked Diego, and soon he left. The girl went to bed almost happy. While reading, she had come up with an idea for a new project. "Tomorrow I'll start working on it," she decided. From the very morning, Carmen immersed herself in the laptop, only breaking away close to noon when she felt hungry. Diego had brought fresh groceries, so she snacked on fruits and cheese and continued to work. This is how each day passed for her. Diego would come by every 2 or 3 days to stock the fridge with fresh food, rest for a bit, and then leave again. So, several months slipped by unnoticed. Carmen finished her project and now thought about what to do with it. She visited a website where she could find grants and saw a program for young scientists sponsored by the governor himself. Without a second thought, Carmen submitted her project. In the following days, she rested, walking around the house and reading fiction. Eventually, she couldn't resist and returned to work, this time on new tasks. She and Diego had become true friends. He started staying longer at the house. Sometimes they spent several days together, discussing various topics or watching movies on the laptop. They cooked together, played board games, and walked in the garden. A few months later, she received a response stating that the governor found Carmen's first project very interesting and promising, and he would like to invite her to the annual reception. Carmen couldn't believe her eyes. Had she really been chosen among hundreds of other scientists? She eagerly awaited Diego's arrival to share the wonderful news. However, when the guy heard Carmen's story, he only frowned in response. "It's too dangerous," he said. Carmen looked at him with pleading eyes. "But I can't hide in this house forever. I want to live a normal life." In the end, Carmen managed to convince Diego, and he allowed her to accept the governor's invitation. Together they went shopping so Carmen could pick out a beautiful dress. When Diego saw Carmen in her new outfit, he couldn't help but admire her. "You look very beautiful, Carmen," he said, looking at her tenderly. Only a few days remained before the reception. The girl tirelessly practiced her presentation, determined not to make a fool of herself. "You'll do great," Diego supported her. Carmen felt something more than friendship blossoming between them, but she couldn't allow herself to give in to her feelings, as she was still officially married to Carlos. Diego seemed to understand that too. Moreover, Carmen was very embarrassed about what Diego was still involved in. After all, he was still connected to the gangsters. Finally, the evening of the reception arrived, which was to be held in the administration building located in the heart of the city. Carmen's hands trembled as she entered the brightly lit hall filled with unfamiliar faces. She was shown to a table in the center of the room. Carmen sat down and waited for the governor to appear. He didn't keep them waiting long. Walking onto the stage, the man greeted the guests and announced that an exciting evening awaited everyone present. Today, young scientists, entrepreneurs, and investors will present their best projects, he announced, inviting the first speaker to the stage. Carmen listened with half an ear, lost in thoughts about her own presentation. Finally, it was her turn to go on stage. As she climbed the steps and began her speech, she felt as if someone was watching her intently. "A whole crowd of people is looking at me," Carmen tried to calm herself. She continued with her presentation, but the strange feeling lingered until the very end. When she finished, the hall erupted in applause. Carmen quickly scanned the audience and saw Carlos. He was staring at her without blinking. Before she could look away, she noticed he was sitting at a table completely alone. Carmen stepped off the stage and made her way to the exit. She didn't want to be in the same room as her ex-husband. However, as soon as she stepped into the hallway, Carlos rushed after her and grabbed her by the arm. "Wait, Carmen," he said. "Let go of me," Carmen exclaimed, shooting him a look filled with anger and hurt. Carlos obediently released her arm. "I just wanted to talk to you," he said quietly. "We have nothing to talk about," Carmen replied. "You betrayed me. You handed me over to the gangsters. And after all this, you think I would want to communicate with you?" "I'm sorry, Carmen, I was such a jerk," Carlos confessed. "And now? Have you changed?" Carmen squinted, asking. Carlos tried to take her hand again. "I would do anything for you," he said passionately. "And what about your mistress? We're no longer together." "The child wasn't mine," Carlos said quietly. Carmen gathered her strength and took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe you. It's over between us." I will find a lawyer and file for divorce, the girl replied firmly, turning away and heading toward the stairs. Carlos watched her in silence. In the car waiting outside was Diego. "How did the presentation go?" he asked. "Wonderful." Carmen smiled. "Are we heading home?" "Yes," the girl nodded, and Diego started the engine. At home, Carmen told Diego about her encounter with Carlos. "I'm tired of being afraid. Tomorrow I'll contact a lawyer. I hope we'll be officially divorced soon," she said decisively. This news delighted Diego. "Carmen," he confessed softly, "I've dreamed of this for so long." He looked at her, and in his eyes, tenderness and love shimmered. Carmen's heart raced, but she tried to compose herself. "I can't be with you, Diego," Carmen said quietly. "Not while you're tied to that criminal group." Diego nodded. "You're right, Carmen. I really want to be with you. But it will take many years before I can break free from my past. I don't want to put you in danger." Tears streamed down Carmen's cheeks as she felt the weight of their situation. Soon, with Diego's help, she moved into a rented apartment in the city center and began a completely new life. She received a grant from the governor and was able to rent her own laboratory. Before long, Carmen became a well-known scientist and inventor, and the world took notice of her work. A year later, Diego sent her a message saying he was no longer involved with the gang. "Do you still want to be with me, Carmen?" he asked. "Yes," replied the girl, who missed him dearly. "I'm downstairs, at the entrance to your building," Diego responded. Carmen quickly got dressed and rushed out of her house. When she saw him, Diego scooped her up in his arms and spun her around. "Will you be my wife, Carmen?" he asked. "Yes, Diego," the happy girl replied. They married and moved to live by the sea, where no one knew them. Carmen continued to write scientific articles and publish them in academic journals, and eventually, she gave birth to twins who also developed a passion for experiments. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed the story, please support the video by liking it and leaving a comment. Thank you very much.